Hello and welcome back to Like Maria. Today we're going to look at some English language issues. We're going to look at prescriptivism and descriptivism. So by the end of this video, you'll know about those issues in English language, just like Maria. So the reason I thought about this today is that I was watching some episodes of The Crown, and in one of those episodes, Prince Charles is on the phone to Camilla, and he talks about a speech he's going to give about the English language. And he talks about how he feels the English language is deteriorating significantly, and they have a discussion about this. And it got me thinking again about prescriptive attitudes towards English language. And so I did a little bit of research and came up with a quote from Prince Charles where he says that young people of today, bearing in mind he's talking in the 80s and 90s, but I'm sure he still thinks that very much, young people of today speak and write English bloody badly. So that's where we're going to start, and we're going to talk about different attitudes. So first of all, let's rewind. I've introduced you to these terms, prescriptive and descriptive. You may well have come across them in your studies already, but if not, I'm just going to talk about them briefly here. So a prescriptive attitude to studying language is one where somebody who's looking at the language thinks that language is quite fixed, that there should be specific rules, and that people should adhere to these rules very strictly. And this makes sure that everyone's speaking in a very similar way with similar grammar and writing in a very similar way with similar grammar, spelling, etc. And it creates an atmosphere where people are aspiring to speak in a particular way because that's seen to be the best thing. So prescriptive grammarians, prescriptive linguists and prescriptive commentators talk about rules. They have books of grammar, books with word lists and dictionaries, and books about how to use the language. Now they're called prescriptivists because if we go right back to the etymology of this word, it is prescribere. It means to write beforehand or to direct someone in writing. So they are prescribing the way that language should be used. They want you to use language in a specific, particular way. On the flip side is a descriptive attitude. A descriptive grammarian will study the language as it is used, and they won't believe that we should have rules and grammars and lists. They believe that we should look at how language develops and how different varieties of language are used by people in everyday conversations, everyday dialogues, and they describe what is happening. So they pick up different accents and dialects and describe those. They look at different contexts in which people speak and they describe those. And they don't look at those uses of language as somehow inferior or different. They look at them as what's happening. So this comes from the word scribere, but describere in the Latin, to describe things, to paint a picture of what's happening. So there you have prescriptive and descriptive attitudes to studying language and to commenting on language. And you can see here that there are some key areas where these two ways of studying language differ, and I've summarised them for you on this slide. So a prescriptive approach will be rule-bound, will be a bit controlling of language. It will be imposed from tradition and history. It will have a notion that there is a correct way and a proper way of doing things, and that if you don't do this, you are not as prestigious as people who do this. So there will be a prestige form, and prescriptive grammarians tend to be quite conservative in their outlook. They look back rather than forward. Descriptive grammarians, on the other hand, look at language as a more spontaneous entity. They try to enable people to use language in lots of different ways, and they validate those. They look at language as having developed from usage rather than developed from people following rules. They embrace difference and diversity. They reject this hierarchical approach, and this is a really important aspect of descriptive grammarians. And because of all this, they are known to be quite liberal in their ideas. So I'm going to run through now some quotations from famous people and famous commentators on language, on the prescriptive camp and then on the descriptive camp. And these quotes are going to be really useful for you to have for your essay writing and any discussion of debate about English language. So first off, we have John Humphreys. He attacks texters, people that are abusing the language he feels through text. They are destroying our language, pillaging our punctuation, savaging our sentences, raping our vocabulary, and they must be stopped, he says. So he characterises diversity in English language and new words and methods as almost Viking pillagers or someone attacking the language, and he says we must fight a battle against it. So that's John Humphreys, prescriptivist number 1. Okay, next up is Lindsay Johns. He is a youth worker and language commentator who works a lot in London. He says, across London and other cities, it is increasingly fashionable for young people to speak inarticulate slang, full of vacuous words such as in it, and willful distortions like ox for ask, or tedious double negatives. So here he's criticising what he perceives as sloppy language, as different language. The word in it and things like, for example, he is criticising and saying that people shouldn't use this if they want to be taken seriously. So there we have prescriptivist number 2. Prescriptivist number 3, and perhaps the arch prescriptivist, particularly when we're talking about written language, is someone called Lynn Truss, not to be confused with the recent Prime Minister. She says, everywhere one looks, there are signs of ignorance and indifference. And this really speaks to the crux of the problem with a prescriptive outlook, is that people are judged by the way they speak and the way they write. And she talks of ignorance and indifference being very poor things. And of course it is not a good thing to be ignorant, but just because someone uses language differently, it doesn't mean that they are ignorant. And that is the key point that I'd like you to get across here. Okay, on the flip side, as we know, we've got descriptive grammarians and descriptive commentators. And it is the case that most 21st century linguists and students of English language tend to be on the descriptive side of the argument. Particularly our great hero, David Crystal. He talks about language change as being something a bit like the tide in the sea. He talks about the constant ebb and flow of words, sounds and structures of the tidal margins of a language. And this is really important to recognise ebb and flow, mix and mix. Things coming together, changing, some not changing. He tells us there is no predictable direction for the changes that are taking place. They are just that, changes. Not changes for the better, nor changes for the worst, just changes. Sometimes going one way, sometimes another. So here we can see this really quite liberal attitude to development of language and acknowledging that different words come and go, language isn't fixed. Second, Henry Hitchens. Spoken language will always be elastic, he says, and I think that's a great metaphor. Elasticity, similar to the tide, coming and going, stretching and compressing. And even if you just remember that one word that Henry Hitchens mentioned, elasticity, being language being elastic, that'd be a great thing to put in either the introduction or conclusion of an essay and to follow through with an argument there, this stretchiness. So remember the tide and the elasticity. He also says English draws strength from being mobile and protean. Its creativeness, its mobility, its ability to adapt is why English has survived. And moving on to another great linguist, Paul Kurzweil, descriptivist number 3. He talks about Lindsay Johns. Now, Lindsay Johns uses the phrase ghetto language to describe some varieties of English he comes across in London. Paul Kurzweil says that Johns talks about the ghetto language and editions of Shakespeare that are in ghetto language that Johns criticises. But Kurzweil says, don't these merely demonstrate that language is infinitely flexible and rich? William Labov, way back in the 70s, proved that African American English, including that spoken by gang members, is grammatically precise and richly expressive. And that's the crux of the argument here, that different varieties have their own internal grammar that they've created. They can be precise and expressive and rich, and that we should not be judging and castigating people for continuing to use language in lively and creative ways. So I would urge you to reflect on your own attitudes to language and language use, and to go and research some more ideas about prescriptivism and descriptivism. So after today, I hope you've understood that topic just like Maria. Please remember to subscribe and catch up on our new English language videos.